Good morning from MPTI, Florida. I'm Pat Sherman. I just wanted to reach out to everybody who may be living in the Orlando area considering a personal training career, or those of you nationwide that are considering a personal training career and due to COVID don't feel comfortable traveling, or there's some travel restrictions, but that's okay because you can live stream into our 600-hour personal training program anytime from anywhere in the world. So we are MPTI Florida from everywhere and anywhere to help you with your personal training educational needs. That being said, we wanted to show you and bring you into our live classroom environment, which you would see every day whether or not you are in class or home live streaming. It's going to cover 382 hours of college core curriculum. Some of the biggest components are going to be your 100 hours anatomy physiology, all the muscles, bones, kinesiology, origin, action, insertion of the body. It's all taught in a live classroom environment via PowerPoint presentation with one instructor. It's taught with word associations and specific ways for you to retain the information. Then there's also 100 hours nutrition. And this enables our graduates to offer their clients what's classified as nutrition, healthy nutrition for the general population. You could do you can monitor and track your client's progress over the course of your training sessions. If somebody came to you and said, "Hey, Susie, I'm a 54-year-old man, asthmatic, diabetic, rotator cuff surgery," you could actually develop a nutrition program for that gentleman based on his needs, whether it's weight loss, weight gain. Special populations is also taught during that program. So if you're diabetic, asthmatic, special needs, we're going to cover those as well, just to allow you to offer your clients as much information as possible and guarantee the results over the course of time. So that being said, we want to take you and show you what a live classroom looks like. And whether you're here every day or at home live streaming, this is going to be the classroom environment.
Presentation at home, you 5 at home. So this morning we're going to be looking at bones and joints. You will find from the test review that I gave you yesterday, a lot of this material that you see on the board today will be coming up and reflected in your first exam. Okay, so we're going to be looking at bones and joints. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the following topic areas. We're going to be looking at this. Functions of the skeletal system first and foremost. From there, we're then going to be going into understanding the anatomical structure of a long bone. You will need to understand the components of a long bone, but also its response to physical activity, which I'll explain. I'll explain it via force production, but I'll also explain it via exercises, because different exercises apply different force applications on bone. Okay? So first and foremost, just a synopsis of the primary functions of the skeletal system or the bones. You will need to know this, so I would encourage you to highlight. But it's a framework for our structure and movement, which it is. It is also a resting ground for our muscles on our body. So remember, your muscles are attached to bones via tendons. They could be also attached to bones directly or via what they call an aponeurosis. Those are 3 different ways. Support and protection. So when you look at certain bones on the human body, such as your ribs as an example, the pelvic girdle, your cranium, your scapula, they protect vital organs in the body. For example, the pelvis protects the reproductive system, and the skeleton, the cranium protects the brain, etc. And they also support. I mean, quite frankly, if they didn't have joints to allow us to articulate or move, and they were interconnected via muscles, tendons, and or ligaments, then we would just fall apart. We would just collapse. Okay. You find also, and you will see this a little bit more later in depth when we look at something called the medullary cavity or medullary cavity, which is the kind of canal-like structure on the inside of a long bone. And that also produces blood for the body. That's where cells, marrows, and things of that particular nature is also stored. It says bones form junctions. We call those joints. Within biomechanics, they also call it pivot points or axis of rotation, also known as fulcrums. But they do. It allows us to articulate. And as you will now understand, the synovial joints of the human body, the synovial joints, meaning the articulating joints more towards the periphery of the body, has multiple ranges of motion. So if you look at the shoulder joint as an example, you have at least 9 different actions there. The knee, you have synovial joints, but you just have 2, where the vertebrae that has limited movement, and that's primarily because you have different types of joints in the body. You have fibrous and you also have cartilaginous. So this is a cartilaginous joint, and then you have a fibrous joint, which is indeed in the skull, and there it's more fixed. People say it's fused, but if it was fused, you know. And clearly when you're a baby, those dovetail configurations seem to be a little bit more open, and that's why it grows, and then it does suture as you get older. So those are the primary functions of the skeletal bones. We then have the skeletal system divided into two elements. You have the axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. Always think about it this way. Yeah, the axial skeleton is always central to the body. Okay, as I'll show you in a bit. It's always centered to the body. Just lost connection there. Whereas the appendicular skeleton is always towards the periphery of the body. Okay, that's how it goes. So, the bones that make up the axial skeleton is your skull, your cranium, your rib cage, and your vertebral column. Now, when we talk about the vertebral column, we're also talking about the sacrum and the coccyx here as well, which are the fused vertebrae. And then you have your appendicular skeleton, so your legs and your arms and, you know, your shoulder, and that makes up the appendicular. Bit of a visual here, so you can clearly see. The purple here, or the blue, signifies the axial. It's centered to the human body, so you get your ribs, vertebral column, head, sacrum, coccyx, and then the good old pink here, which includes the clavicle, all right, shoulders, arms, legs, pelvis here, that forms part of your appendicular skeleton. So, let's get into a little bit more of the science-based stuff. So you probably don't realize this, but about 4 to 6 months from now, all the bones in your body would have been replaced, remodeled. You don't feel it, you can't see it, but it's happening. So as you sit here now, the osteoclasts and osteoblasts, which are the primary bone cells that is responsible for bone remodeling, is systematically breaking down bone and forming new bone. Okay. So for example, if you were osteoblast training certified, as an example, you would offer osteoblast training programs for about 6 months. Because I did a T-score in 6 months via a DEXA scan, I could actually prove that I have increased your bone mineral density. As a consequence of increasing your bone mineral density, I've made your bone stronger. So therefore you are less susceptible to things such as osteopenia and osteoporosis. Okay? However, your bones start to form about the 7th week of embryonic life. So not that long after conception. But when your bones are starting to form, they are more like a cartilage or cartilaginous type structure. We call it osteochondral ossification. And so this cartilage, throughout the 9 months of gestation, will start to ossify from the inside out. So by the time that you are born at 9 months, or some people at 7 or 8 months, your bones is well formed and they are hard and they are as you now have. But bones undergo remodeling throughout our life cycle. There are certain phases in life where those bones clearly grow more rapidly, such as puberty, your bones grow more in length. And there are also circumstances in life, natural circumstances in life, where your bones are a little bit more susceptible, let's say, to being reduced in terms of its strength and its bone mineral density. For example, post-menopausal women. The onset of the menopause sees a decrease in estrogen. Now, estrogen is directly affiliated with these two bone cells. So, a decrease in estrogen as a consequence of the menopause, or as a consequence of some forms of contraception, or as a consequence of somebody who exercises too much, has a low body fat percentage, because that's key here, and people don't recognize that. That's why don't want for a low, extremely low body fat percentage, because it is not always healthy, as I'll explain in a bit. But these bone cells, throughout our life cycle, okay, especially like I said, when it comes to the more rampant phases of bone building in your life, such as puberty, etc., you have the osteoblasts and osteoclasts working nicely together. Meaning that as fast as the osteoclasts are breaking down old bone, this is also known as bone resorption as well. another term that you will see in textbooks, so I would encourage you to write bone resorption down. You might also see that on an exam from here on in. But bone resorption is to break down bone, but as fast as the osteoclasts are breaking down bone, you then have the osteoblasts coming behind, building bone up. We call that bone formation. And as long as this relationship is on an equal playing field, so to speak, my bone health is going to be good. But the problem arises when the osteoclasts break down more bone than the osteoblasts are building. And so now what we have is a discrepancy. That discrepancy is that if you're breaking down more bone than you're able to build, it's going to lead to porous bone. Okay, so I just want you to write this down because you will see this at some stage. So a discrepancy in which the osteoclasts resorb or break down more bone than the osteoblasts. You know, it's easy to remember the function of these two. The osteoblasts, B, bone building. Okay? So a discrepancy in which the osteoclasts resorb or break down more bone than the osteoblasts build equals a condition called osteopenia, and then that goes on to osteoporosis. And that's essentially called brittle bone disease in simple terms. One of the characteristic signs of people that have osteoporosis is, first of all, a loss in height. Okay? I will also tell you this now, that this is no longer just the persuasion of older people, so I don't want you to think, oh, this is an old person disease, because it isn't. For example, if you are a young lady and you have been on a form of contraception, let's say an injectable form of contraception or a subcutaneous form of contraception, or even oral forms of contraception, it stops your menstrual cycle for long periods of time. It means that technically for that particular phase of your life, you're the same as a postmenopausal woman. You don't have a menstrual cycle. It means that your estrogen levels in your body for that moment in time, in that period in time, is not enough to elicit the correct bone turnover of these two bone cells. So anytime that your estrogen levels are low, you're more likely to have an increase in osteoclast activity and a reduced activity of the osteoblasts, which leads to a decrease in your bone mineral density, which then perpetuates into osteopenia, which is the first phase. If you catch people with osteopenia, hopefully we can reverse, right? If you go towards osteoporosis, you still can reverse, but it's probably going to take longer, and it depends on a whole lot more variables. Age being one of them, for sure. Go for it.
When I first started my menstruals, I was having really bad, so my doctor recommended that my parents put me on Depo-Rare, and they did. So by the time I was 20, I had to come off of it because I lost bone density in my hips.
Thank you.
And so
the Depo-Provera is the injectable form of contraception, for those of you guys at home who don't know, but that's one of the worst ones. Even the subcutaneous one, I believe, according to the British research papers. Yeah. And so, did you get a bone scan at that stage?
I did. I had to get a bone scan because I was in the military and I was having a lot of hip problems.
Right.
And they took me to get a bone scan, and it was the results of it was the Depo-Provera had caused it because it had been in my system for so long.
You know, one of the things back in the UK. For those of you who don't know, my job was, I used to bone scan people in addition to do personal training and lecturing. My company was Osteo Healthcare. We did bone scanning. We used a DEXA scan, a portable DEXA scan. And we were in the city of London one day, and this 29-year-old young chap came in. And he said he came in because, you know, the boys next door had a bit of a banter, and they said, well, you know, go get your bones checked, you know, and if you do, you know, we'll buy you lunch and buy you a few beers and whatnot. So he came next door, so we got him to fill out the Part Q, which was specifically for osteoblast training and whatnot. And then we put him on the scan, and he came back with a T-score. I don't know, can you remember what your T-score was?
I don't.
It'd be interesting, if you can actually get, if you still have that bone scan. Yeah, and that'd be fantastic. So we can kind of share that information for sure, because I do teach that on the osteoblast training course as well, how to interpret a DEXA scan. But anyway, this young gentleman, he had a T-score of minus 3.7, which was extremely osteoporotic for somebody who was 29 years old. This is a young guy that actually participates in soccer and various other sporting activities, and he's very wealthy. He works in the city of London as a trader, and indeed he says every time he goes to the French Alps and he comes back, he says that his ribs are sore for weeks and weeks and weeks. So we didn't correlate it at the time, but on further inspection, when we did the third run through of a DEXA scan, because it makes you think, here I have a young man who's physically active, but his T-score is, minus 3.7. This is something that you would equate with somebody who's in their 70s or 80s, who was quite frail and things of that particular nature. So on further inspection of his PAR-Q, he was on forms of corticosteroids, prednisone or prednisolone, for a long period of time in his teenage years because of an eye condition. And as a consequence, that was the only thing that we could pinpoint that had deteriorated his bone mineral density. That's why often when you see a lot of these pharmaceutical drugs being advertised on TV, one of the things they'll always say is might cause osteoporosis, because it does have that debilitating effect on your bone mineral density. So essentially, the soreness that he was having, bless him, was associated with all these ribs being cracked from being on the ski slopes and twisting and turning rapidly and things of that particular nature. So now he knew, and he came in laughing and he left, and he was a sad lad. I mean, you can imagine. He's been told that you have osteoporosis. It's horrible. So it was a wake-up call for us, essentially, because like everybody else, we think and we associate osteoporosis with being an older person. But it's not the case at all. And I've seen and I've interviewed and I've bone scanned people, females specifically, in their 20s, 21, 22, who were gymnasts, former gymnasts. So if you look at the sporting activities, whereby the aesthetics of it all is very important. If you're a gymnast, they want you to look a certain way, don't they? Okay, you got to be slender, you got to look good. You're in a uniform that warrants the aesthetic figure. And so these young kids are put under enormous stress and strain to look a certain way. They starve themselves, some of them are malnourished, they train for multiple hours in a day, they don't have a menstrual cycle, and these things are not normal. And so you are bone scanning people who are in their 20s, should be in the prime of their life in terms of establishing a great bone mineral density foundation, and they're osteoporotic at a very, very early age. It's so very, very sad. So if you do get clients who suffer from anorexia nervosa, bulimia, other eating disorders and subtypes, people don't have a menstrual cycle, people who are on long-term corticosteroid use, that's a red flag. It really, really is, okay, for them having compromised bone health. So like I said, yes, you won't just go straight into osteoporotic. There is a transition from osteopenia into osteoporosis. So it says here, remodeling is the constant process of these cells. So by what age do we saturate our bone growth? And I think it could be quite a spacious argument. Some texts say 20, some say 25, some say 30. I think between the ages of 20 and 30, we can quite safely say that we have established our bone mineral density. Okay? We are dealing with biologically evolving organisms here. So it's very, very hard to quantify one particular age for everybody on planet Earth. It's just not possible. But safe to say between the ages of 20 and 30, you would have and should have accrued as much bone mineral density as you can. And here's the real thing. If you think about your retirement depends on how much money you have saved, right, from your working years. Do you agree? Okay. Well, your bones are exactly the same way. If you can accrue or build your bone mineral density in your formative years, by the time you hit your 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, that bone mineral density and bone mass should sustain you through for the rest of your life. That's the way you should look at it. So every time you go out there and you do good bone health training programs, and by that I don't mean walk for 45 minutes a day, because the initial definition of bone health training back in the day was weight-bearing activity. Well, I'm sorry, but weight-bearing activity for us doesn't give us any of the acute variables that will tell us specifically how to design a program. We want specific guidelines. We also want specific guidelines in accordance with how bone responds to a mechanical stress. So unless we fully understand the biomechanics of bone and how it responds to a mechanical stress, we cannot train it effectively, right? If I say to you, go out there and lift a heavy weight, you can expect to gain what?
Muscle.
If I ask you to lift a heavy weight, you can expect to gain what?
Strength.
Strength, thank you. If I ask you to do 6 to 12 reps between 75 to 85% of your 1RM, you can expect to gain muscle. If I ask you to do 12 or more repetitions, you can expect to gain muscular endurance. You see how it goes. So with bone, we have to fully evaluate how it responds to a mechanical stimulus. So if I can get Stevie across here real quick. So let's consider a weight-bearing bone. That is the femur. Can you boys at home see? All good? So here we go. Weight-bearing bone, the femur, right here, yeah? So this particular bone, just like any other bone on the body, has its strengths and its weaknesses. So for example, if I was to go out there and let's say do a push press, so here's a bone. If I did a push press, okay, that would supply my bone with a compressive force, because two forces are directed towards each other, so that would be forms of compression. Okay. However, if I went out there and I did a leg extension as an example, that would have one force directed here, the other force directed here, in the opposite direction across the surface of the bone. That's what we call a shear, or transverse force application, right? If I went out there and I did, let's say, a pull-up, that would be tensile force, especially on my arms, because indeed, you have two forces acting in the opposite direction, so that would be tension. So what have I just done? I've actually grouped most exercises that we can do into these four different force applications: compression, shear, and tension. Okay? As a consequence of these three different types of force application, we need to know that our bones in our body responds differently to those force applications. We are strongest in tension, we are as half as strong as steel in compression, and we are weak in shear. So if I put that into an exercise context, we are strong in our bones when we're doing a pull-up as an example, also when we're doing a squat or a deadlift, but if we're doing a leg extension, we're weaker. And that's because bones, just like the human body, is known in a biomechanical context as being anisotropic. So if I was to get you to do this as an example, so can I borrow you real quickly? KD. So here's what we're going to do, so you boys at home can see. So we have a piece of paper, right? A piece of paper really should tear quite easily. So let's pull it. You're pulling and I'm pulling. Here we go. And we're putting a bit behind it. It's not breaking, it's not tearing. We are providing it with a what force on the board? Two forces acting in the opposite direction. Yeah, it's a tensile force application. Let's say, for example, we could push this together. That would be compression. It's still not going to break, right? But if we did this, so you take one side, I'll take the other, boom. That represents your shear. You have two different force configurations across the surface of the bone. Thank you very much. And therefore it is weak. So it says a lot about how you should train bone, right?
Right.
Okay. In addition, bone is also viscoelastic. The word viscoelastic from a biomechanical standpoint suggests that bone is stronger and stiffer if a mechanical stress is applied that is fast for a short period of time. So when you're looking at exercises such as push press, jerks, and their variations, whether you're standing or on your knees doing it or are in the kind of split squat position, those are the preferred exercises. I'm not saying that a squat is not as effective, but when you do a squat, it's not as dynamic, is it, as when you do variations of the Olympic lifts, right? Okay, so those are best to elicit the responses that we want. In children, it says osteoblasts are more active. As you age, the osteoclasts become a little bit more active. True, they do. And that's why it hence leads to this, and then onto osteoporosis. Okay? So let's examine a long bone. What I want you to do at this stage is recognize what's on the board in terms of the anatomical structure of a long bone. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the slideshow on hold, but I want you to have a blank sheet of paper, portrait, whole sheet of paper, and we're going to draw it, and we're going to label it a little bit more extensively than what you see here. Okay? So some additional information. Are you good? So here we go. So I'm going to switch this off real quick. And then let's get a blank sheet of paper, and here we go. I want you to title this the anatomical structure of a long bone. Anatomical structure of a long bone. Okay, and here we go. So, nice big drawings at home, you lads at home. Blank sheet of paper, here we go. That's your long bone, okay? Let's say, for example, it represents the femur or your thigh bone right here, okay? That's what we're talking about, so that long bone. On this long bone here, you will find that on the ends, where the joints are, you will have cartilage. So I want you to draw some cartilage, just like what I'm drawing here, and I want you to label it. Cartilage. Some textbooks say hyaline cartilage. It's cartilage. It's there.
All right, thanks for visiting MPTI Florida. I'm Pat Sherman. Just wanted to let you guys know to please follow us, like us, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to try to do a really good job this year and give you as much information as possible on the fitness industry, health and wellness. Give us a call, text 407-772-0057. That's Pat Sherman, 407-772-0057.